What Roman officials did to prisoner wives after conquest was unspeakable. The screams from the forum had finally stopped. In the shade of a temple colonnade, Julia Marciana stood motionless, her stola still clean despite the chaos that had consumed Carthago Nova for 3 days. She was the wife of a Carthaginian naval commander, a woman who had hosted senators in her atrium, who had worn Egyptian silk and Phoenician purple. Now she watched Roman legionaries drag furniture from her home, while a centurion made notes on a wax tablet, cataloguing everything she had ever owned, including her. Her husband Hasdrubal had died on the walls during the final assault, his body still hanging from the ramparts as a warning. She had expected death to follow. What came instead was far more calculated. A Roman official approached her with a scroll, speaking in accented Punic. "You are now property of the Roman people. Your status will be determined by the quaestor." He said it the way one might announce the weather, bureaucratic and inevitable. If you're drawn to the systematic machinery of Roman conquest and what happened when empire consumed entire cities, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us uncover more accounts from the fragments that survived. Military records, slave ledgers, and the occasional letter that dared to tell the truth. Now back to the story. The Romans didn't conquer through chaos. They conquered through administration. When a city fell, specially trained officials called quaestors moved through the rubble with military precision, separating citizens into categories: men of military age for execution or enslavement, children for auction, women for assessment. But wives of enemy commanders occupied a special category, one that appeared in Roman law as captivae nobiles, noble captives. The term sounded dignified. The reality was anything but. Julia and 17 other women, wives of Carthaginian officers, magistrates and wealthy merchants, were taken to a converted warehouse near the harbour. The building still smelled of olive oil and garum, but now it served as a processing centre for human cargo. They were stripped of their jewellery first. Every ring, every bracelet, every fibula was removed and recorded. One woman tried to hide a small cameo of her children in her mouth. A soldier pried it out with casual efficiency, added it to the pile and struck her across the face for the delay. Then came the physical examinations. Roman physicians moved down the line, checking teeth, limbs, overall health. They were assessing value, determining which women could be sold for premium prices and which served other purposes. The doctors called out their findings to scribes who recorded everything: age, physical condition, languages spoken, skills possessed. This wasn't cruelty born of passion. It was industrial-scale dehumanization, Rome's specialty. Julia was 26, fluent in Punic, Greek, and rudimentary Latin. She could read, write, manage household accounts, and embroider. The physician noted all of this, then added a final observation that made her blood turn cold. Suitable for domestic service in senatorial household. She understood what that meant. She had heard the stories whispered in Carthage about what happened to noble captives sent to Rome. But first came the temporary arrangements. The 17 women were divided among senior officers as praeda, spoils of war. This was ancient tradition, dating back to the Republic's earliest days. A successful campaign meant plunder, and officers expected their share. The fact that this plunder consisted of human beings whose husbands lay dead in the streets was irrelevant to Roman law. Tribune Gaius Claudius Pulcher claimed Julia for himself. He was young, ambitious, from an old patrician family eager to reclaim former glory. He had fought well during the siege and earned the right to first selection. When he entered the warehouse and pointed at her, she felt the last thread of her former life snap. She was no longer Julia Marciana, wife of a naval commander. She was property, selected like one might choose fruit at market. That night in the Tribune's commandeered villa, she learned the particular humiliation reserved for noble captives. Claudius didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a symbol of Carthaginian defeat, a living trophy to be displayed and used as proof of Roman superiority. The violation wasn't random violence. It was ideological, a demonstration that Carthage's elite had been reduced to serving Rome's pleasures. When it was over, he had wine brought in and spoke to her in Greek, assuming she'd prefer the civilized tongue. He talked about Rome's destiny, how Carthage had forced this war, how she should be grateful for Roman mercy. He seemed genuinely to believe that being his captive was better than death. Perhaps in his mind it was. The Romans prided themselves on their version of clemency. They let you live, even if that life was stripped of everything that made it worth living. Military records from the siege of Carthago Nova, preserved in fragments at the Capitoline archives, list the distribution of captives among officers: 17 women of notable families, 43 women of merchant class, 112 women of uncertain status. Each entry included a name and a recipient. Julia appeared as Punic female literate, assigned to Tribune G. Claudius Pulcher. No mention of her husband, no acknowledgement of who she had been, just a line in a ledger, efficient and complete. The next morning, the women were brought together briefly before being dispersed to their new master's quarters. They stood in the courtyard, some bruised, all changed. Julia recognised Lady Sophonisba, wife of a Carthaginian magistrate, now claimed by a centurion. Their eyes met for just a moment, a silent acknowledgement that they were witnessing the death of their world. One woman, Emilce, wife of a temple priest, had refused to leave her house when the soldiers came. They found her 3 days later, having taken poison rather than face capture. The Romans recorded her death with irritation, wasted value. Her body was thrown into a mass grave with the other casualties, denied even the dignity of a separate burial. For those who survived, the real ordeal was just beginning. Within weeks, the campaign concluded, and the legions prepared to return to Italy. The noble captives were separated from common slaves and placed on special transport ships. They travelled in the hold, but with slightly better conditions than the cargo slaves. Enough food to maintain health, basic medical attention to preserve value. The journey to Rome took 19 days. Julia spent those days in darkness, listening to the creak of wood and the sob of women who had given up hope. Some prayed to Tanit, the Carthaginian mother goddess. Others had already abandoned their gods, deciding that deities who allowed such suffering didn't deserve worship. Julia didn't pray. She marked days on the wooden beam above her head with her fingernail, creating a record that no one would ever see. When the ship entered Ostia, they were transferred to wagons for the final journey to Rome. This part was deliberate spectacle. The wagons moved slowly through the streets so citizens could see the fruits of conquest. Children threw stones. Merchants paused their business to jeer. Roman matrons looked on with a mixture of pity and contempt. Pity for the suffering. Contempt for women who had failed to die rather than endure dishonour. The procession ended at the Atrium Auctionarium, Rome's primary slave market near the Temple of Castor. But the noble captives weren't sent to the auction blocks immediately. They were held in private cells while arrangements were made. Roman law required that captives of notable families be registered with the Questor Urbanus, the urban treasurer, before sale or transfer. This created a paper trail, proof that Rome's conquest was legal and orderly. A letter discovered in the Egyptian papyri collection at Oxyrhynchus mentions this process. Written by a Roman merchant to his partner in Alexandria, it casually notes, "The Carthaginian lot arrived yesterday, 14 noble females, 2 already assigned to senatorial households, the rest available for private sale. Prices starting at 3,000 denarii for the literate ones." He discussed them the way one might discuss a shipment of wine, evaluating quality and speculating on profit margins. Julia's fate was already decided. Tribune Claudius had claimed her as permanent property rather than selling her at auction. She was transferred to his family estate on the Esquiline Hill, one of Rome's most prestigious neighbourhoods. The house was massive, 3 stories wrapped around a central garden. Marble everywhere, fountains trickling in the atrium. It was beautiful and suffocating. She was given a small room off the kitchen, barely large enough for a sleeping mat. Her duties were explained by the vilica, the head of household slaves. She would serve at dinners, attend to guests, and be available whenever the master required. The vilica, herself a Greek captive from decades earlier, delivered these instructions with dead eyes. She had learned long ago that sympathy was a luxury slaves couldn't afford. The other captive wives were scattered across Rome. Lady Sophonisba was sold to Marcus Porcius Cato, the stern censor who publicly condemned luxury while privately enjoying its fruits. She served in his household for 7 years before dying of a fever, unmourned and unrecorded except as a line in his account books. Loss of Punic slave. domestic service, value 2,800 denarii. Another woman, Daphne, was purchased by a wealthy equestrian who specialised in training cultured slaves for resale. She was taught additional languages, refined her Greek, learned Roman poetry and music. 2 years later, she was sold to a governor heading to Syria for 8,000 denarii, triple her original value. The equestrian was praised for his business acumen. No one asked Daphne how she felt about being transformed into a luxury commodity. Inside the Claudius household, Julia learned the specific degradation reserved for noble captives. She was paraded before guests as proof of Gaius's military prowess. "This is the wife of a Carthaginian commander," he would announce during dinner parties. "Notice the quality. Educated, refined. This is what we're bringing into civilization." The guests would nod appreciatively, as if she were a particularly fine sculpture. When Gaius married a Roman woman from an equally prestigious family, Julia's situation became more complicated. The new wife, Fulvia, understood exactly what Julia represented: a living reminder of her husband's adventures, a threat to her dignity. Fulvia couldn't sell her without Gaius's permission, so she found other ways to assert dominance. Julia's duties increased. Her rations decreased. Small cruelties, precisely calibrated to break her spirit without damaging her master's property. At night, Julia began scratching records into the plaster wall of her room, hidden behind her sleeping mat. Names of the women she had known, dates as best she could remember them, the name of her husband. Her children, who had been sold separately at Carthago Nova, she didn't know where they were or if they still lived. The wall became her archive, proof that she had existed as more than a slave. Roman law provided no protection for captive wives. The Lex Julia de Adulteris, which governed sexual conduct, explicitly excluded slaves from its protections. A master could do anything to his slave property without legal consequence. If a slave became pregnant, the child belonged to the master. If a slave died from abuse, it was destruction of property at worst, requiring no more than financial restitution. Legal texts from the period discuss these matters with clinical precision. Ulpian's Digest notes: "A captive woman loses her status as wife upon capture. Any children born from her after capture follow the condition of the mother, that is, slavery." The law transformed marriage into a legal fiction that evaporated the moment a city fell. Hasdrubal's wife became Gaius's property, and the law saw no contradiction. Some women found ways to navigate this system. A few became indispensable to their households, achieving a kind of informal power through competence and cunning. One Carthaginian captive, mentioned in Pliny's letters, became the trusted administrator of a senator's household, managing finances and even offering political advice. She remained a slave, but wielded more influence than many free citizens. The Romans found this amusing rather than troubling. Proof of their system's flexibility, they said. Others were eventually freed through manumission, though this was rare for noble captives. Freedom papers discovered at Herculaneum include a woman named Sophonisba, freedwoman of Marcus Tullius, freed after 23 years of service. But freedom meant little without resources, family, or homeland. Most freedwomen remained dependent on their former masters, living in permanent limbo between slavery and citizenship. Julia was never freed. She served in the Claudius household for 19 years, watching Gaius's career advance, seeing his children grow up, attending endless dinner parties where she stood silent against the wall. She learned to make herself invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to exist without existing. In 163 BCE, during a particularly harsh winter, she fell ill with pneumonia. The household physician was called, but Gaius decided treatment would cost more than her remaining value. She was moved to a storage room to die, given water but no medicine. It took 4 days. When she died, a notation appeared in the household accounts: Punic slave, domestic service, deceased, no replacement cost authorised. She was burned in a common pyre with other household waste. No marker, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that she had once been Julia Marciana, a woman with a name, a family, a life before Rome came. But the wall in her room remained. 70 years later, during renovations, a worker discovered the scratched names and dates behind a crumbling section of plaster. He couldn't read Punic, so he assumed it was some kind of curse and had the wall destroyed. The names of 17 women, carefully preserved for decades, were reduced to rubble and swept away. We know about this only because the worker mentioned it to his supervisor, who mentioned it in a letter to a friend, which survived by accident in an Egyptian trash heap and was excavated 2,000 years later. That's how close these stories came to complete erasure, one casual conversation away from eternal silence. The practice of taking enemy wives as captives continued throughout Roman history. During the Jewish Wars, Josephus mentions thousands of women captured and distributed among Roman officers. In Dacia, Trajan's campaigns produced similar results, the pattern repeated across 3 continents and 6 centuries. Conquest, categorization, distribution, erasure. Roman triumph celebrations made this process visible and celebrated. Captive women were paraded through Rome in chains, walking behind the victorious general's chariot. Crowds cheered. Poets wrote verses commemorating the spectacle. Artists created frescoes showing defeated peoples kneeling before Roman power, always including prominent women to emphasize total domination. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome, depicts the sack of Jerusalem. Among the carved figures are women in chains, their heads bowed, their bodies bent in submission. Tourists photograph it daily, rarely considering that each carved figure represented a real person, a woman with a name and a story that Rome deliberately forgot. If you've heard this story tonight, understand that it's preserved in fragments: account books, legal texts, casual letters, archaeological accidents. The women themselves left almost nothing because they weren't allowed to. But those fragments are enough to reconstruct what Rome tried to hide. That conquest wasn't glorious, it was administrative brutality refined into policy. Leave a comment, tell us what you felt reading about what they endured. And if you want more stories that empires tried to erase, subscribe and step deeper into the shadows with us. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how efficiently they were forgotten.